This next lesson is the second part of Key Issue 3. We will be focusing on commercial farming, and we will contrast that with subsistence farming. There are 6 main features of commercial farming: mixed crop and livestock, dairying, grain, ranching, Mediterranean, and commercial gardening. Let's take on mixed crop and livestock farming first. This type of farming is one of the most common forms of commercial agriculture in the United States. It involves the integration of crops and livestock. Most of the crops are fed to animals rather than consumed directly by humans. In return, the livestock can supply manure to improve soil fertility to grow more crops. A typical mixed crop and livestock farm devotes nearly all land area to growing crops, but derives more than 3/4 of its income from the sale of animal products like beef, milk, and eggs. In the US, pigs are often bred directly on farms, and cattle may be brought in to be fattened on corn. In the US, corn is the most frequently planted, and it generates higher yields per area than other crops do. Soybeans have become the second most important crop in the US, and this is very common on mixed commercial farming regions. And like corn, soybeans are mostly used to make animal feed. Where different types of agriculture is cultivated is really important, especially with proximity to markets. We will discuss this with regard to the von Thunen model on a later slide. Next, let's talk about dairy farming. A dairy farm specializes in the production of milk and other dairy products. Because milk is really perishable, dairy farms have to be closer to their markets than other products. Dairy farms that are located farther from consumers might be more likely to sell output to processors to make butter, cheese, or dried, evaporated, and condensed milk. The reason for this is because products need to be kept fresh, and they can be kept fresh longer than milk does by selling off to processors to process the product. It can also be safely shipped from remote farms. Moving on, the major crop on most farms is grain, like wheat, corn, oats, barley, rice, and millet. Commercial grain agriculture is going to be different from the mixed crop and livestock farming because crops on a grain farm are grown primarily for consumption by humans rather than by livestock. So, with the mixed crop and livestock, all of that would be grown for the purpose of feeding the animals. Large-scale grain production, like other commercial farming ventures, are more common in your developed countries. This is because it is heavily mechanized and also conducted on large farms. It's also oriented to consumer preferences. Commercial grain farms sell their output to manufacturers of food products like breakfast cereal and bread. The most important crop grown is wheat, and that's used to make bread flour. Commercial grain farms are generally located in regions that are too dry for mixed crop and livestock agriculture. And they're also located primarily in North America, with the large-scale grain production being concentrated in the winter wheat belt through Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma, and the spring wheat belt through the Dakotas, Montana, and southern Saskatchewan in Canada. Next, we have livestock ranching. And ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area. Commercial ranching is conducted in several developed countries besides the United States, and it's increasing in developing countries. The US used to be the leading producer of meat in the world, but China has passed the United States as the world's leading meat producer since 1990. It now produces twice as much. The United States remains the second largest in the world, and behind the US is Brazil. Many South American countries have become major producers of meat for world consumption. For example, the cattle industry grew rapidly in Argentina, in part because the land was devoted to ranching and was relatively accessible to the ocean, making it possible for the meat to be transported overseas to different markets. Mediterranean agriculture exists primarily on the lands that border the Mediterranean Sea in southern Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. Farmers in California, central Chile, and the southwestern part of South Africa and southwestern Australia also practice Mediterranean agriculture as well. Even though this land is not surrounding the Mediterranean, the climate is very similar. Lastly, we have commercial gardening. Commercial gardening and fruit farming is the predominant type of agriculture in the southeastern United States. The region has a long growing season and humid climate, and it's also accessible to the large number of consumers in the northeast United States. This type of agriculture is referred to as truck farming, and that comes from the Middle English word truck, which means barter or exchange of commodities. Truck farms grow many of the fruits and vegetables that consumers in developed countries demand, like apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, mushrooms, and tomatoes. Take a look at figure 9-30 located on page 326 of your textbook. This map indicates wheat production. As you'll see, China and India are the leading wheat producers, followed by the United States. Commercial grain farming includes the production of wheat in developed countries. Developing countries also produce wheat through intensive subsistence farming. Looking at figure 9-31 located on page 327 of your textbook, you'll notice Mediterranean agriculture. This photo is of a vineyard on the hillside overlooking the Mediterranean Sea in Italy. The Mediterranean climate region and agricultural type features extensive production of crops like grapes, pictured here in Italy, and olives, as well as tree nuts. The best wines in the world are said to come from Mediterranean regions. Think of the Napa Valley in California, or wines that come from Spain, France, or Italy. These Mediterranean areas share a similar physical environment. Every Mediterranean area borders the sea, and the prevailing sea winds provide moisture and moderate the winter temperatures. Most crops in Mediterranean lands are grown for human consumption rather than for animal feed. Horticulture, for example, is the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, and this is most common in the commercial base of Mediterranean farming. Looking at figure 9-32, located on page 327 of your textbook, you can see commercial gardening and fruit farming, also known as truck farming. This includes peanut farming as well. This is a picture of a farm worker harvesting peanuts in Georgia. As was mentioned before, truck farms grow many of the fruits and vegetables that consumers in developed countries demand, like apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, mushrooms, and tomatoes. Some of these fruits and vegetables are sold fresh to consumers, but most are sold to large processors for canning or freezing. Now look at figure 9-33 located on page 328 of your textbook. The United States produces nearly 40% and China more than 20% of the world's maize, also known as corn. In many countries, corn is grown to feed livestock more often than for direct human consumption. Now, time for the von Thunen model. This comes from figure 9-35 located on page 329 of your textbook, and it's a very important model that you should be prepared to discuss. The von Thunen model indicates the location of agricultural activities based on the value of products and their transportation costs. First, let's look at the first ring around the center. Remember, the center is considered the city. The first ring indicates market-oriented gardens and milk. This is because they are very expensive to deliver, and they also have to make it to the market quickly because they're perishable. This is why the first ring indicates horticulture and dairying. Looking at the second ring, the next ring out from the cities contains woodlots, where timber is cut for construction and fuel. Closeness to market is important for this commodity because of its weight. This is indicated on the model as forestry. Looking at the third ring, the next ring was used for various crops and for pasture. The specific commodity was rotated from one year to the next. As you can see in the model, that's indicated by crop rotation. and may include the next two categories as well as the enclosed field and the three field. Looking at the last ring, we're looking at grazing. And so this is the outermost ring devoted exclusively to animal grazing, which requires a lot of space. It's also going to be furthest out from the city. To sum up, the first two rings are going to be closest to the city because of perishable goods and the cost of heavy timber. When looking at the last two rings, we know that this can be further out from the city and also requires a lot more space. Let's look at figure 9-36. This map is located on page 330 of your textbook. As you can see, India has replaced the United States as the world's leading milk producer. Even though India is the world's leading milk producer, dairy is still an important commercial agricultural practice in developed regions like North America and Europe. This last map, figure 9-38, is found on page 331 of your textbook, and you will see that China is now the world's largest meat producer. The type of animal raised depends on cultural preferences and climate. So you will also see the type of animal that's most commonly cultivated in these different regions of the world. Developing countries are increasing their meat production, but China, again, is the world's largest meat producer. The darker areas on this map indicate higher meat consumption, and the lighter it gets, the less citizens are consuming meat. When looking at the types of animals that are cultivated in livestock ranching around the world, we see that cattle is much more prominent in the Americas, but sheep is very common in parts of the Middle East, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe. To recap some of the important points that were covered in Key Issue 3, agriculture can be divided into 11 major regions. This includes 5 subsistence that we talked about and 6 commercial regions. Don't forget that we also talked about fishing. In subsistence regions, pastoral nomadism is prevalent in drylands, shifting cultivation in tropical forests, and intensive subsistence in regions with high population concentrations. Lastly, in commercial regions, mixed crop and livestock is the most common form of agriculture. Dairy, commercial gardening, grain, Mediterranean, and livestock ranching are also very important. This is the end of the lesson on Key Issue 3, Part 2.